So, welcome everyone to an In Conversation with. My name is Emma Smith, and I'm delighted today to be in conversation with Dr. Anna Volkmer, who's going to talk about better conversations. So, Anna, thank you so much for giving your time today.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.
So our plan for today is I'll give you a little bit of background about empowered conversations, and then Anna's going to open up a slideshow, and we're going to and talk to us about her work, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A at the end. So just a little bit of background about empowered conversations. We deliver communication courses for family caregivers and professionals across Greater Manchester. We also offer one-to-one dementia-focused therapeutic support for family caregivers. And every so often we do these little webinars where we have researchers or practitioners or people with lived experience who come in and have a chat with us. So if you have any questions and you want to jot them down on here rather than write them down on your notepad, you should have a little question mark in a speech bubble. So you can just pop your questions in there, and then we'll make sure that we've got a good 10-15 minutes at the end to pick up those questions. So I think that's all I need to say, Anna. I'm going to hand over to you.
Super. And I will go share my slides. Is that working?
It's working really well.
Super. Okay. So thank you so much for having me. I'm actually a practitioner by background. So I'm a speech and language therapist, and I've been working in the NHS, for well over 20 years now. And I started working with people with dementia about, in 2007. And I was working with people with this quite new idea of a language-led dementia. And I was trying to deliver evidence-based care, as we do, and I found that there wasn't very much. And that's really what inspired me to go into research, to try and create some of the research evidence. And I guess what I found there was much more focused on word practice, whereas I found that what people were asking me for was guidance on how to actually have a conversation. So I thought I'd situate the this talk in a bit of an overview of where these language-led dementias sit. So I hope I'm not kind of telling you how to suck eggs, but just to remind you that dementia is an umbrella term for a group of progressive neurological diseases that all they all have in common that they affect a person's thinking skills. And we often talk about there being the main types of dementia, which are broadly categorized into on this slide into Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, and vascular dementia. Now, what I would say is when I often speak about these diseases, it's often really useful for me to highlight that actually, when we talk about Alzheimer's, there are the more typical types of Alzheimer's that we all know about, so which I would describe as a memory-led disease. This is and this population form the large majority of people living with dementia in the UK. So we estimate there's around 944,000 people with dementia, and of those in the UK, and of those over 500,000 have this very typical Alzheimer's disease. Now, there are less typical types of Alzheimer's, and these include the posterior cortical atrophy, so the Terry Pratchett Alzheimer's, which affects people's vision and perception, and the logopenic type, or logopenic aphasia, which is a language-led type of Alzheimer's. Within the frontotemporal dementias, we have the behavioural variant, and behind my pink box, sorry, this was an animated slide that's no longer animated, it says semantic dementia and and progressive non-fluent aphasia. And these two, under the behavioural variant, these two are the language-led types of frontotemporal dementia. Whereas the behavioural type is the more typical type of frontotemporal dementia, which we would describe as a behaviour-led disease. Now, in Lewy body dementia, we have both dementia with Lewy bodies and Parkinson's disease dementia. So they have in common these proteins, these Lewy bodies, but the main difference being that people with Parkinson's may have lived for several decades with a motor disease before they develop the cognitive symptoms, whilst people with dementia with Lewy bodies develop the cognitive symptoms either first or synchronously with some motor symptoms. But there are, there's lots of other dementias. There's vascular dementias. I'm not going to go too much into those. There's the cortical, subcortical, but there are hundreds of other dementias. But I really am focused in my work at the moment on these three: the semantic, progressive non-fluent, and logopenic, which have in common that they're also all led by a language difficulty. And we call those primary progressive aphasia, because the primary progressive symptom, the main symptom getting worse, is aphasia. That's the language. Now, these pink boxes are here just to flag, actually, although I'm speaking about this, what some of us may feel is a more niche area, or perhaps a less typical aspect of dementia. What we know is that people with typical Alzheimer's will often develop secondary symptom, and it's often an aphasia that looks a lot like logopenic variant PPA. So it looks a lot like a primary progressive aphasia. It shares many features, and people with behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia will also often develop a secondary aphasia that looks a lot like a progressive non-fluent or non-fluent aphasia. And people with Parkinson's, with dementia with Lewy body, they'll also often develop secondary aphasia symptoms. So what we know from our research is that actually what I'm describing here has got potential to impact the wider population of people living with dementia, and that's why we feel it's so important. But that's the complicated stuff out of the way. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the communication difficulties of people with primary progressive aphasia. Now, I've mentioned this is a language-led disease, and we know that language difficulties carry a high disease burden. So people often become more isolated because they're unable to communicate with people. And when I say people become more isolated, I'm talking not just about the person, but also about the people around that person. We believe it's critical for caregivers and professionals and family members to be able to manage these communication difficulties. And at the moment, speech and language therapy is really the main intervention, the key intervention that we can offer primary progressive aphasia. So what do interventions look like? What's the research literature on speech therapy for PPA at the minute? Well, let me tell you. So the majority of this research up until now is really focused on words. And I would call this impairment focused interventions, because really these types of interventions have tried to work on the problem. So language or words might be a problem for people with PPA. So we will practice words or sentences. There hasn't been very much research at all on actually what I would describe as a functional intervention. So an intervention that helps a person go to the shops to buy some bread or their own coffee or their own mulled wine after our previous discussion. There isn't very much research on that, on how people can actually have a conversation and interaction. I undertook a review of this literature, and we only found about 18 studies. But what we did identify is that those studies had some commonalities. And one of the commonalities is they tend to focus on strategies people are already using. So strategies they've adapted as their diseases progress and develop for themselves. And these interventions all include another person, so a communication partner. We also know that when we speak to speech therapists out in the community, that I did a survey back in 2017 across the UK, and I found that actually speech therapists tend to prioritize communication training, so focusing on conversation, which is in contrast to what the research evidence had focused on up until that date. So there was obviously a gap for this. It wasn't just me and my clinical experience. There was obviously a gap. But the first thing before I went ahead and just filled that gap, I was quite interested in the actual conversations. So how do these conversations work between people with PPA? What actually happens? And we're still doing lots of this work. But actually, one of the key things I would say, kind of a big headline, is that what we know is that families and friends of people with PPA are they're actively searching for guidance. They've told us as soon as their loved ones get diagnosed, they start Googling. They start looking, how do I talk to my husband, wife, mum, dad, partner, neighbor, trying to work out what they should be doing to help. We've also done several studies where we've looked at those conversations. So we've actually made video recordings of people having conversations in their natural environment. So not in an experimental setting, not in hospitals, but we've actually asked people to go into their everyday life and make a video recording of just an everyday conversation. And what we found is there's certain things that other people do in conversations that can be really helpful, as well as things that the person themselves does that can really help the conversation flow. And sometimes it's something as simple as giving somebody more time to take a turn, or, for example, accepting a gesture. If they can't say the word, just interpreting the gesture as a turn. But there's also things that can happen in those conversations that can make them not flow, that can halt them, that can make things more difficult. And one of those things, as an example, is we've seen, and this is not common only to the what we see in conversations with primary progressive aphasia. We've actually seen this in conversations when people have a stroke and have got communication difficulty. We've seen it also when people have brain injuries and have communication difficulties. But we see people around them changing the way they speak sometimes. For example, asking what we would call test questions. So asking the person a question when they actually know the answer. And I'll give you a really good example of this. So I was talking to a woman and she says, I just watch my dad and I watch him talk to my mum, and I know they've had lunch together. And he says, darling, what did we have for lunch? And then it becomes like a naming task where mum has to say, but they both know what they've had for lunch. They know the answer. And my mum looks at me and she rolls her eyes. And I think she just wants to have a regular conversation. So with that in mind, my clinical experiences, I'd been recognizing, as I've just described to you, some of these conversation, I guess, behaviors. In the work I'd done with people with stroke aphasia and brain injury, I saw partners doing similar things. And there'd been a well-researched intervention that had been developed called Better Conversations with Aphasia. And I was often using that therapeutically, but it wasn't quite right, because people who have strokes and have brain injuries, they don't get worse. And we're working with people who progress. So in my research, I developed a similar intervention called Better Conversations with Primary Progressive Aphasia. And I'm going to give you a little window into that intervention. But first of all, I'm going to tell you a bit about how we developed it. And probably what's really important to say is that I looked at the conversation analysis literature, and I've shown you some examples of that. So I looked at these video recordings of what actually happened, all the research of what actually happens in people's conversations. I also looked at behavior change theory. So, okay, that's what goes well, that's what might not go so well. But it's all well and good. And I've had this clinical experience, I can tell people to speak slowly till I'm blue in the face. But actually speaking slowly is really hard work. So we need to work out, how do we help people change their behaviors? And as a speech therapist, I might see somebody for a certain number of sessions, but then the family need to go off into and will carry on beyond speech therapy. So how can I teach people things that they can manage in the future on their own? So I looked at some of that theoretical literature, and I took that to a group of people, my patient and public involvement group. I wanted to create an intervention working with people with PPA and their family members, not developing it for them, but developing it with them. So we did lots of work. I took that literature to them, told them all about what I'd found, and I showed them the old intervention from the stroke aphasia, and we developed new handouts together, new forms, new session plans, and we created a draft. And then we showed it to speech and language therapists and said, what do you think of the new draft? And they kind of said, yes, this is lovely, this is great. Oh, I'm not sure about that. So that was really useful. We also talked to more people than just in our small working group, because we wanted to make sure we represented more voices. And we ran focus groups, and he said, oh, what do what's your experience of conversations, and what's your opinion on how things could change? And we took those ideas as well, and we refined the intervention, and we piloted it. So I'm going to tell you about the pilot of actually how it worked, what happened in the research, but I'm going to give you a sneak peek, just a very overarching view of what this therapy looks like. So in our intervention, what we do is we make a video recording of the couple we're working with having a conversation. But we let them make that recording. We give them, or they make it on their own device. So we've got that recording. Then we spend some time telling them a little bit about the conversation analysis, the science of conversation analysis. So we talk about what conversation is. We break it down into the mechanics. So we talk about turn taking and questions and test questions. So we tell them about test questions, and we tell them about the messiness of conversation. And then we watch some of their videos, and we show them normally 2 or 3 clips, and we try and show them things that we think have worked well, and we ask them what they think. So we support them to actually analyze their own videos, and we support them to reflect on what they think is happening in their own conversations. And then we use that to identify what they want to do more of and what they want to do less of. And then we practice. So we do lots of work in the sessions and between sessions to practice, and we make more videos and look at them together, and we problem solve for the future. So we say, okay, we've done all of that work. What might happen as time goes on? So we wanted to know, we've put together this what looks like a nice intervention that's 4 sessions long, which is about the average amount of time, unfortunately, a speech therapist has in the NHS. So does it, is it something that people like? Can we, if we were to do a big trial, a randomized controlled trial, would people come and do that with us? Can we retain people? Is it acceptable to people and their family members? And is it acceptable to speech therapists? Can we train speech therapists to all deliver it in the same way? Or is it something else? Is there a nice person effect going on? Can we make sure we're all measuring the same thing? And how do we measure this thing we've created? So what we did was we recruited 3 NHS sites. So I had 3 speech therapy departments in 3 different areas of the country, and with 6 speech therapists, and I taught them how to use this intervention. In actual fact, what then happened, of course, is that one of the therapists left, another trust closed one part of their department, so we had to add more hospital sites, and so we ended up with 11 NHS sites across England and Wales. So we had a broader representation, and I trained 36 speech therapists in total. And what we did was we asked them to look at just their regular caseloads, and see if when somebody with PPA came up on the caseload, they'd invite them to participate in the study. And the therapist would then, if the person was interested and willing and they met the inclusion criteria, the therapist would consent them to the study. And those local therapists would also do the pre-intervention assessment. So we asked them to do several assessments, and I'll just tell you what they are. So that a comprehensive aphasia test is just a language test. So we had some information on that person's difficulty, so we could corroborate their diagnosis, but also work out where they were in terms of severity. We asked them about quality of life, the impact of aphasia on their lives, their confidence, and we asked the partners to do some measures of burden and stress as well. And we made these videos. So we actually used the videos to measure behaviors. So the therapists, local therapists would do this, and then we'd randomize the participants to either having the BCPPA, the better conversations we developed, or having no speech therapy for 4 weeks. And if they had the BC, the intervention we designed, we'd video record every single therapy session to make sure the therapist was delivering it in the way we intended. And then we sent in a student speech therapist who was masked. The student didn't know what had happened to the person, and the student would go and do all the measures again. Along the way, after the student had collected all the data, so the student would do all those measures and then actually go and see the original speech therapist and collect all the information we needed, including along the way the goals they'd set. So in the therapy, I mentioned to you, we set goals and we used goal attainment scaling, so a rating system to work out whether the goals being set in therapy were being achieved. And I'll give you an example of this to really bring it to life. So, for example, this is a real example. So, for example, often people with PPA, we ask for between 2 and 3 goals per. That's what we recommended in this intervention that should be worked on. And a good example of this is a person with PPA would work on using gestures more when they had problems with word finding, or, for example, if they couldn't think of someone's name, that they would give additional information about the person's identity. Whereas the communication partner was one of this is a reasonably regular goal that comes up. They wanted to ask less test questions, and they wanted to practice waiting before offering prompts or helping the person with word finding. So that's the study, and I'm going to just walk you through this slide, which is a summary of results. So we actually had more than 70 potential participants in this study, but what we found was that many of them were referred to speech therapy too far down their disease journey, and there are many reasons for that that the therapists had identified. Often it's because they referred way beyond the initial stages, and actually perhaps when they had swallowing difficulties. We also found some people had partners who were working or had caring responsibilities. Some people didn't have partners, and we also found we actually recruited 22 people, but due to COVID, we ended up with 18 people who completed the whole thing, because this was a face-to-face study. So we had 18 people. Once they started, they didn't stop. They did the whole thing. So we felt that meant that, and they said, when we asked them, they said the people who did this said it was great. They found it was actually quite overwhelmingly positive. And some of what they were really positive about was things like the video recording, which they felt was a really essential ingredient. The therapists, we video recorded them. They adhered to the treatment protocol really closely, and with the training we gave them. And when we looked at the videos, so what we did was we had videos made before and after therapy, and we coded the behaviors and counted them. So we coded test questions and gestures, and we looked at how many test questions we used before and how many after, and we found that the number of test questions used went down. We found that the amount of gesture used by the people with PPA went up. We found that family members and communication partners were able to give more time. So we found that behaviors we targeted did change in these recordings, and we actually found that aligned with the videos. So 29 of 30 of the videos were either achieved or overachieved. The only goal we weren't able to kind of compare was one goal, which was around how someone felt about a conversation, which was really difficult to judge in line with those videos. But when we did actually ask specific people to fill out specific rating scales of how they felt, what was the impact of their aphasia, what we found is that there was a specific measure that looked at not a quality of life broadly, not at confidence, but actually about at the impact of their language difficulties, that really showed a change in the direction we thought it should. So this was the first ever randomized controlled pilot study, not only in the UK, but actually worldwide with people with PPA. It was the first UK-based pilot study of a communication partner training intervention, we call that, when you invite 2 people in. And we felt it was very promising. It was extremely promising. It was a pilot study, though, so we couldn't categorically say the results were effective for everybody. But it did tell us lots of information. And the intervention we've developed, we are ultimately aiming for it to be freely available on the UCL platform. But before we do that, we're actually in the midst of, or we're about to start the next phase of our research on this. And that is, so what I was quite interested in is that actually, although we saw an improvement in goals and behaviors and the impact of aphasia, people said to us, you're not measuring what really matters. There's something about this therapy. You haven't quite measured what we got out of it. So what we're doing we're doing some more work around measures at the minute. We're also looking at remote delivery, because people said to us, Kara said, I can't come in person. So we're looking at delivering this online. So we're modifying it, we're tweaking it to become an online intervention. And then we're going to compare if online versus face-to-face, are they equitable? And we're also looking at earlier. So we're doing a study and recruiting people directly from their diagnosis, from diagnostic centres. And interestingly, we're also adding in people with Alzheimer's, because this is a rarer disease. So but yet people with Alzheimer's, clinically, I use it with all the people I described earlier and their families. So we get and include some of them in the study. So we get a larger group and kind of support people earlier in their disease journey. And that's the current work we're doing. So this first thing, I'm actually developing a core outcome set, asking people what we should measure. We've got 19 countries worldwide. We've got people with PPA and their family members from 19 countries worldwide telling us a bit about what's important in their lives. We're also doing some work laterally. So I'm working with people with PPA and their family members and Rare Dementia Support, who are a national charity. And we're saying we're crafting a care pathway together that we can advertise on that. I say advertise. What I mean is essentially we can create a map, a pathway that people can hopefully use with their when they're navigating their journeys. So hopefully people can get to speech therapy and benefit from it sooner. But also health professionals might have a bit of a guide to say, okay, this is when I should refer to speech therapy. So we're doing this work because when we spoke to people with PPA and their family members, they said, oh, this is lovely research, but you also need to do all these other bits of work. You can't just do the research. You have to think about the top down and the bottom up. So then the other thing is we're doing this trial looking at remotely delivered better conversations. So that really brings me to the end of my talk. So if you are interested, if you want to watch this space, here are my contact details. And of course, as ever, I should do all the thanking. So this is my huge list of lovely people and lovely groups who all have helped me loads along the way and who continue to help me with this work. So thank you so much, Emma.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. That was so interesting. Okay, so it's your turn now to ask some questions. So if you have a question, find the little button that's got a question mark and a speech bubble and type it in. And in the meantime, I'll ask some questions if that's all right, Anna.
Yeah.
So this next piece of work, because you were saying you want it to be freely available, but it sounds like it's not going to be freely available until after this piece of work. So what are the timescales around this piece of work?
That's like the golden question. So in reality, the timescales around this piece of work are lengthier timescales, so probably around 5 years. However, so that's before we can kind of release the materials to be live online. But what we are doing is we have a book. So there's the Better Conversations book, and we also, which is very practical resource, and I should add here at this juncture, there is actually, so Better Conversations was initially developed for people with stroke aphasia. There's Better Conversations with primary progressive aphasia. There's two other very recent pieces of work going on, which is Better Conversations with Parkinson's and Better Conversations with developmental language difficulties with children. And I think this ties right back to the beginning of the talk when I was mentioning we see similar patterns of behavior in conversation between people who have different types of communication difficulty. So the principles of this intervention are really valuable across disorder, across conversations, across human beings, but we need to tailor these interventions to meet the individual needs. So the book tells you about the broader principles with application to different specific areas. And then the other thing to say is we run courses. So we do online training twice a year, which is really focused on stroke aphasia and primary progressive aphasia. And that's not free, neither is the book, but they are certainly they're practicable training courses.
When you were talking about sort of people recording their conversations and setting their own goals, it felt incredibly empowering that they would, you know, you're not saying do this, don't do this. You're sort of giving them an outline, they're recording it and they're identifying, you know, just by watching it back, oh, I do that a lot, don't I? And maybe I should do that as much. And then you get behavior change because they're identifying it themselves. Have you got any sort of examples that like really stand out, you know, of people that you're like, oh my God, that just worked so well with that particular couple?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm sad I couldn't show. I didn't really. It's tricky showing videos of people on these kind of meetings, but I can definitely. There's a couple that I work with, and there's a good example. We made, so I actually, before I talk about them, what I should say, sometimes people say to me, oh, video recording, oh, but what I find really interesting is and that's normally health professionals or researchers. When I talk to people, they say, oh yeah, I video record myself all the time with the grandkids, or like it's so normal. And if I say, oh, we're gonna ethic, they say, oh, somebody wants to listen to me have a conversation about the garden, or so be it, I'll publish it on the internet. People are much less concerned about these kind of things than we are. So I think we are perhaps being perhaps a bit paternalistic about this approach to videoing. And videoing, people say to me that is the most important thing, and that, I think we all do it. We don't video, but we all reflect. You often walk away from a conversation and think that went really badly and I don't know why. And that's one of the things I think this intervention does, is it helps you do that, which is we all do, but it helps you make it much more concrete. And I worked with this couple, and we made this recording, and I actually do use it in the training session, because I can't use it on these kind of in webinars that are published on YouTube, but I can use it. And they said, we looked at the video. So essentially it's a conversation where the husband is saying to his wife, and his wife has the diagnosis. He's saying, so who are we seeing on Tuesday, and what's their name, and where do they live, and who are they to you, and where do you keep a note of the appointment, and how often do you see them, and it's 30 seconds, and it's just, and we showed it to them, and he went, oh my gosh, he said, I look like I'm cross-examining a witness. And his wife said, yes, do you know that when I wake up in the morning, I open my eyes and you say, what's your PIN number? Where do you live? What's your date of birth? And he said, well, I'm trying to help you remember. I thought it would be good practice. And she said, but you're doing it all the time. And he said, okay, I completely understand what you mean. So interestingly, they were both also happened to be solicitors by background. So he had this quite intense communication style, and he said, I'm not going to do that. And we made a video recording at the end of therapy. And in the video recording, they're talking about going out for dinner, and he's saying, oh, I just can't lose weight. And she's saying, no, you can't, but you know, it's always been this way. Why is this a surprise to you? And they're laughing and giggling. And we looked at the video afterwards, and she said, this is like the conversations we had in our 20s. I'm so glad we're back. And he became really tearful about it. He was saying it can be so powerful. Yeah.
That's massively powerful. I'm just imagining like waking up and like being bombarded with a load of questions when really just, well, I personally obviously would want a cup of tea. Don't know what you drink in the morning, an orange juice, I'm hoping, rather than a can of Coke. Phil has asked a question. He says, great work, Anna. It may sound obvious, but why are test questions so problematic for people with PPA? And what are the best strategies for avoiding the natural tendency to ask them when someone can't locate a word?
So test questions are, when you look at what context test questions are used in. So test questions are, I mentioned earlier, they're a question where we know the answer. So generally, test questions aren't used by one peer to another peer, or a partner to a partner, or friend to a friend. So if you imagined, Phil, that if you were talking to your friends or your partner and they started just asking you, what's the color of my top? What's this object called? I imagine how that would feel. It would change the power relationships. So the people in general who use test questions are people in power relationships. So teachers of students, medical professionals of patients, sometimes parents of children. So if that's, given that's the kind of natural setting in which those questions occur, people will often feel like their roles are changing. And family members will often say the same. They'll say, I feel more like a therapist or a carer. And that's one of the big issues. So it's often not just an issue for the person, but can often be fueling this difficulties in role reversal, role changes for partners. So it's problematic for both people in the relationship. 9 times out of 10, I will add that I have had one experience where I showed a video to a couple, and the wife was asking lots of test questions, and the partners, and they said, yeah, we've all done that. And we said, okay. And we actually also took the opportunity. We said, do you mind if we show it to your children, adult children? They were, yeah, who we were working with as well. We showed it to the adult children. They said, yeah, that's been their relationship. Mum's always done that with dad. And we said, okay, that's completely fine. And that's actually the key in fact, is we're not trying to change something that was already there before. If that, everybody has a different conversational style. And I'm sure you'll all recognize that from when you speak to your partner, or when you speak to one child or a different child, or one parent or a different parent, or one sibling or one friend. You'll have a different style of conversation with different people. And that's why it's really important to make this person-centered. Sorry, I've been going off on this, talking about this, without answering the second part of Phil's question. And that was, what are the best strategies for avoiding this natural tendency? And I think what we know from behavior change theory is that asking someone not to do something is incredibly difficult. And what's more successful is if you ask them to do something else instead. So depending on what the person is doing, there might be in their conversation other things they're doing that are quite successful, which is why it's really useful to identify which things are helping your conversation flow. So maybe you could do, instead of asking test questions, can you do one of the things that helps your conversation flow, such as, I don't know, in this case, it was the case that the description I gave, it was just he just started giving his opinions on things, and she would share hers. So, or with other people I've worked with, it was just giving, maybe not saying anything. Or for other people, it might be asking an opinion question. I keep coming back to opinion questions, or asking an open question, a different type of question instead of a test question. So it just depends on the couple.
Thanks for that, Anna. It made me think, so obviously you did the before and after evaluation with people. Did you go back any, after 6 months, after a year, or have you got plans to go back just to see, is it still making a difference? Or
so because we were really piloting the it was a pilot feasibility study rather than an effectiveness study, we didn't. But we do have plans to do that. We're going to do a double baseline and then do a follow-up study. I think the thing is, given this is a progressive disease, we would anticipate people's language will change and get worse. So we don't actually anticipate that we will see the same, we won't see in many ways maintained conversations in that respect. But what I would say, based on my clinical experience, where I see people often over years, off and on, and what I would say is that, so I can give you a very specific example. I worked with a couple, and the husband, what he found is he maintained the skills. He could adjust, but sometimes he needed what he called a kind of boost or a top up, and that often was just one off session, and where he felt he needed that opportunity to revisit the strategies and that he was working on. So it's actually the husband who found that he was really benefiting from that opportunity, and because he felt upskilled in the kind of reflective process, often that meant we wouldn't go through the entire 4 sessions, and he'd sometimes make a video in anticipation and send it to me. So then we just view bits of the video together. So it just depends. But I'd say top-ups are useful to kind of hone people's skills.
sorry, I was just thinking, I hope no one's dropped one there, because I'm just like looking in the chat thinking they'll be in there, and I didn't spot that there's just another place there. Sorry. If you've got any more questions, sorry, Anna, that was very distracting. Everything changes on the screen.
Doesn't matter. I can see it says someone is typing.
There we're in anticipation now. Said, yeah, that idea of a top up, someone to come back, so he could come back to you, and as things change, just reflect on that and think about what other changes he might need to make.
Yeah,
and
I think
absolute sense.
I think that's completely usual. I was talking to I'm part of an international group of speech therapists, and we were saying that it's, if you go to the dentist tells you, says, come back in 6 months, or maybe we don't all comply with that, but certainly come back in a year. And you don't go to the dentist always with a problem. You go for a checkup. And I don't know why we, as in therapies, expect people to initiate that themselves when they've got a problem. What we were saying is, given we're working with people with progressive disease, I think anticipating review is completely rational and really important. And people have said to us that they need, particularly if somebody's living with a language-led disease, to see a language specialist for a review or a top-up is important for connectedness. It's not necessarily the case that they definitely need to see the speech therapist, but they need to have the contact with a consistent person to explore and connect them with the relevant people. So I think it's a bit more complex than many other diseases, because we can't always anticipate the trajectory somebody's going to take with dementia, and that's probably often quite broad across the board. These are complex diseases, and so I'm a huge advocate for frequent review and continuity, even when that's hard and challenging to deliver within our current commissioning structure.
I was just about to say, does that happen in practice? Because it doesn't, it feels like people come in, oh, I've got a problem with this. That's the intervention. See you later. Oh, now I've got a problem with this. You know, it's that, isn't it? Rather than that sort of regular contact with somebody.
It is. And I think, yeah, it is. I think that's, yeah, so I work at the National Hospital, which, and as it says on the tin, it's a national service, and I see people kind of across England, but I only see people with PPA, and so they come. So that's kind of maybe quite useful. So I think there are models in which when we're not in, you know, when we are, it depends. I'm starting to verge into political territories, aren't I? It's tricky, but I think I certainly am a huge advocate for that model, even when we're massively constrained. If we can work that way, it doesn't mean we personally need to, but we might need to locate services that can work that way. That can be really useful, or at least recognize that that's something that would be a potentially useful model. But there is a question in the chat now.
There is a question. So do you have any strategies for keeping the conversation going? Well, we've been practicing it now. No, not really.
No, I think sometimes people say, oh, you want to make a video of us having a conversation. We don't actually have conversations. And I say, well, you know, how do you decide what you're going to eat for dinner? And do you interact at all? And they say, oh, no, obviously we interact, but we don't talk about, you know, we don't have in-depth conversations about politics and what we, you know, what our opinions are on things. And I said, well, that's one type of conversation. When I'm talking about conversation and interactions, we mean it in the broadest sense. And I think it's really worth, so thinking about that gentleman I worked with over many years, he said, you've taught me to look to listen. So actually what I would say is perhaps a top tip for keeping an interaction going is to look to listen as well. And that can mean, for example, I was working with another couple and we were talking about interaction. He said, oh, we don't, you know, she's mute. She didn't say anything. And we were talking about what they do together. And he was saying, oh, well, we do go to the park. She had some mobility. And when we walk, we hold hands and she pushes me down the path that she wants to go down. And I said, oh, so is that communication? And he said, oh yes, that's her. That's an interaction. That's her. So actually, I think that I would say that's probably my top tip, is thinking about it beyond the spoken word. And that might mean looking at gestures. It might mean providing stimulation. So there's lots of work done around photos and music. And I would say there's a really amazing study, and it's something I often bring in to conversation work. And that's this idea of using images. So there was a study done that basically showed if a person with logopenic PPA, so the Alzheimer's type of PPA, went away and took a photo during the day, then came back to their family member, told the families what they'd done that day just verbally, and then told them verbally with a picture, with a photo, there was more content, there was more said, and it was more relevant than if they did it without a photo. So I think photos are a huge resource because they're context, it provides a context. There's, you know, it's there in front of you. It can be really stimulating. So it's something that's come up time and time again. One of my couple I work with, they now go through, and I'd say probably most of us have this. They said, oh, got all these photos I need to sort, lifelong photo. We keep meaning, and they said, okay, now what we're going to do. And so his wife, every kind of couple of months, gets down a new box, and they spend 10 minutes every couple of days going through the old photos. And she said, it's a chore I need to do anyway. So I'm actually going to do it. We're going to do it together. And they've made it a kind of point of interaction. So I thought that was a really lovely example of something you could kind of build a protected tiny 10 minutes, and it, you know, make it a regular event.
No, it is really lovely to do that. And yeah, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh my God, it's all digital now, isn't it? Thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures sitting there in files to be sorted at some point.
One day, exactly. So why not do it together?
Fantastic. Does anybody have any more questions to ask before we bring this to an end? I might just launch the little survey if that's okay. So I'll just pop that up and let people. So if you just want to let us know how you found today's talk. The other day I tried to take it off so that it wasn't quite in your face, but then you can't vote. So sorry, Anna. It just has to happen while we're looking at it.
Nice and anonymous though, so no, I don't know what anyone's saying.
Well, that's true. That's true. So you said there's 19 countries that you're working with.
Yeah.
Is that through your international group?
Yeah. So we wanted to have representation across all the World Health Organization regions of the world, but we haven't managed to find anybody in Africa. So we have we're working with, and I'm going to warn you, there's a like a European Song Contest sentence coming up where I list all the countries. So we have speech therapy therapists who've got together a group of PPA and their family members and asked them what the most important outcomes are. And we've got that in Brazil, Chile, America, Canada, Iceland, Norway, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Netherlands, England, Turkey, Israel, Australia, India, Hong Kong may be coming. I think that's
wow.
So
that's good going.
Yeah, exactly. We think it will be useful. Phil's got another question. Have you recommended video resources that we can look at to find out more about these approaches? I have not, but I can send the link to the stroke version of the Better Conversations with Aphasia, which is publicly available to everybody.
Brilliant. And then I wondered if you know the image that you talked about, that image research. Have you got anything around that, or is it just easily Googleable?
I can find the article and send it to you. Yeah, absolutely.
That sounds really good. Thank you. Cool. Nice to have resources that we can share out. Yeah. Okay. This is your last minute to ask a question. So if there's anything pressing that you want to ask Anna, then please do. Anna, it sounds like we'll have to have another conversation in 5 years anyway, won't we?
Definitely. I'd love that. Thank you for having me today.
No, thank you so much for coming along. Okay, I don't think anyone's got any more questions. So Anna, thank you for your time. Phil said thank you. Brilliant work. It really is. It's absolutely fascinating to find out more. So yes, thank you so much for your time. Next week, we're having an in-conversation with Professor Claire Sir. Thanks so much. Fascinating. Really fascinating. And interesting. Oh, there's lots of lovely words coming up now, Anna.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you, everybody.
So next week's webinar is looking at cancer patients who also have dementia and their outcomes. Thank you so much. Really interesting talk. Oh, Axel, they're all being very lovely, aren't they, Anna? Okay, I'm going to leave you to your afternoon. So thanks again, Anna. I'll speak to you soon and take care, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Bye. Thank you now.